My name is Beverly, and I'm 28 years old. 3 days before what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I walked into my childhood kitchen and found a note that changed everything. The elegant cream paper with my mother's perfect handwriting simply read, "Wedding's off. Expect a call from my lawyer." My hands trembled as I read those words twice, then 3 times. 8 months of planning $200,000 of their money, and 3 years with Marcus suddenly felt like they meant nothing. But instead of screaming or crying or calling them immediately, I did something that surprised even me. I folded the note carefully and whispered, "Understood." Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, because what happened in the next 48 hours will absolutely shock you. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this ends. Growing up as the only daughter of Dr. Margaret Thornton and attorney William Thornton meant living in a world where everything had strings attached. My parents weren't just wealthy, they were Connecticut old money wealthy, the kind of people who belonged to country clubs that had waiting lists longer than most people's mortgages. Dad's law firm specialized in corporate mergers, and Mom ran a private cardiology practice that catered to politicians and CEOs. From the moment I could walk, they had my life mapped out. Piano lessons at 4 horseback riding at 6 debate team in high school, and a full ride to Yale for economics. They paid for everything, and I mean everything. My college tuition, my first apartment in Manhattan when I started working as a financial analyst, even my car. A beautiful silver BMW that I thought was a graduation gift, but later learned was still registered under Dad's name. The control was subtle but absolute. When I wanted to study art history, Dad explained how economics would be more practical for someone in my position. When I considered moving to California for a job opportunity, Mom mentioned how family should stay close. They never yelled or threatened. They just made their expectations clear and watched as I naturally aligned my choices with their wishes. That's how I lived for 25 years until I met Marcus Rivera at a coffee shop in Midtown. He was debugging code on his laptop, completely absorbed in his work coffee growing cold beside him. When his laptop battery died and he asked to borrow my charger, I was struck by how he said please and thank you, like they actually meant something. Marcus was everything my parents pretended to accept, but secretly disapproved of. He grew up in Queens, the son of a janitor and a school cafeteria worker. He'd put himself through community college, then transferred to a state school, graduating with a computer science degree and more student debt than my parents spent on wine in a year. But he was brilliant kind and had built himself a solid career as a software engineer without anyone's help. When I brought him home for the first time, my parents smiled and asked polite questions about his work. Mom served dinner on the good china, and Dad poured expensive wine while asking about Marcus's career trajectory. They seemed charming and welcoming, but I caught the look they exchanged when Marcus mentioned his student loans. Over the next 3 years, their comments became more pointed. "It's wonderful that Marcus is so ambitious," Mom would say, "but ambition and financial stability are different things." Dad would make jokes about mixing business with pleasure when I mentioned lending Marcus money for his car repairs. They never directly criticized him, but their message was clear: he wasn't good enough for their daughter. When Marcus proposed 8 months ago, I was over the moon. We'd been living together for a year, and I'd never been happier. He proposed in our tiny Brooklyn apartment with a ring he'd saved for months to buy. It wasn't the biggest diamond, but it was perfect because it came from love, not obligation. My parents' reaction was carefully measured enthusiasm. "How exciting," Mom said, hugging me tightly. "We should start planning immediately." Within a week, they'd booked the Fairfield Country Club, hired the best caterer in Connecticut, and begun assembling a guest list that included more of their friends than mine. "We want to give you the wedding you deserve," Dad explained when I protested the expense. "This is our gift to you and Marcus." The budget ballooned to $200,000, a sum that made Marcus visibly uncomfortable, but that my parents treated like pocket change. The planning process revealed more cracks. They questioned every choice Marcus and I made that deviated from their vision. Our playlist was too contemporary. Our preferred photographer was not established enough. When we suggested a smaller, more intimate ceremony, Mom looked hurt and asked if we were ashamed of the family. 3 weeks before the wedding, Dad sat me down for what he called a practical conversation. He slid a thick document across his desk explaining it was a prenuptial agreement to protect everyone's interests. The terms were brutal. Marcus would have no claim to any assets I brought into the marriage, including the trust fund from my grandparents that I'd never even known existed. More concerning, the agreement included provisions about Marcus's debt and financial obligations that essentially made me responsible for his past, while giving him no security in our future. "It's just a formality," Dad assured me when he saw my expression. "Smart people protect themselves." But looking at those pages, I realized my parents saw Marcus as a threat to be managed, not a person to be welcomed into our family. The morning I found the note I'd been humming while making coffee, thinking about final dress fittings and wondering if the weather would cooperate for our outdoor ceremony. The happiness evaporated the moment I saw my mother's handwriting on that cream paper. I read the note again, searching for some explanation, some hint of what had changed overnight. "Wedding's off. Expect a call from my lawyer." No explanation, no apology, just a cold statement of fact. They weren't even brave enough to tell me in person. My first instinct was to call them, but every number went straight to voicemail. Dad's office assistant said he was unavailable, and Mom's receptionist claimed she was with patients all day. It was like they'd coordinated their avoidance. Marcus was in Chicago for a crucial presentation with potential investors for his company's new project. When I called him, his excitement about the meeting died the moment he heard my voice. "What do you mean they called off the wedding?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "Beverly, that doesn't make sense. We just had dinner with them Sunday. Everything was fine." But everything hadn't been fine, I realized. Dad had been unusually quiet during that dinner, and Mom had asked pointed questions about Marcus's presentation trip. They'd wanted to know which company he was meeting with, how long he'd be gone, even which hotel he was staying at. "I need to figure out what's happening," I told Marcus. "Finish your presentation. Don't let this ruin your opportunity." After hanging up, I sat in the silence of our apartment and tried to make sense of the situation. That's when I noticed other changes. The wedding vendor confirmations I'd left on the kitchen counter were gone. The final guest list we'd been reviewing had disappeared. Even the folder with our honeymoon reservations was missing. Suspicious, I logged into the wedding planning account Dad had set up to manage expenses. The account was empty. Not just zero balance, but completely closed. $200,000 gone without a trace. My hands shaking, I called the country club. "I'm sorry, Miss Thornton," the events coordinator said, her voice carefully neutral. "Your parents called this morning to cancel the reservation. They mentioned there would be no charges since this was a family decision." The caterer told me the same story. So did the florist, the photographer, and the band. My parents had systematically dismantled our wedding in the span of a few hours, using their money and their names to erase 8 months of planning. But the real shock came when I started digging deeper. I accessed my own bank accounts, the ones I thought were mine, and discovered that Dad was listed as a co-owner on every single one. The apartment lease was in his name. The car registration showed him as the primary owner. Even my credit cards were connected to accounts he controlled. In 28 years, I'd never truly owned anything. I'd been living in a beautiful, comfortable cage, and I'd never even noticed the bars. That evening, I found a manila envelope slipped under our apartment door. Inside was a private investigator's report on Marcus and his family. 20 pages detailing his student loan debt, his family's bankruptcy from 10 years ago when his father lost his job, even his credit score and spending habits. The report painted Marcus as a financial liability, someone who would drain our family's resources. It mentioned his unstable employment history because he'd changed companies twice in 5 years to advance his career. It criticized his family's poor financial planning, without mentioning that his father had been laid off during the recession. But what made my blood run cold was the recommendations section. The investigator suggested that Marcus was potentially motivated by financial gain and advised immediate termination of the relationship to prevent asset exposure. My parents hadn't just decided to cancel the wedding. They'd been planning this for months, gathering ammunition to justify their decision. They'd reduced the man I loved to a collection of numbers and perceived risks, ignoring everything that made him wonderful. The worst part was realizing they'd been watching us evaluating our relationship like a business merger that had failed their cost-benefit analysis. Every dinner invitation, every family gathering, every seemingly supportive conversation had been an opportunity for them to gather intelligence. Harold Chen called at exactly 9 a.m. the next morning. I'd known Harold since childhood. He was Dad's college roommate, his law partner, and someone I'd always considered a family friend. His voice was formal and cold as he explained the legal implications of my situation. Beverly, your parents have instructed me to inform you that all financial support is being terminated immediately, he said as if he were reading from a script. This includes the apartment, the vehicle, and any credit facilities they've provided. Harold, what's really going on? I asked, hoping our personal relationship might crack his professional facade. This can't just be about the wedding. Your parents are concerned about your judgment, he replied carefully. They believe your relationship with Mr. Rivera represents a significant financial risk to the family. They're prepared to help you through this transition, but only if you end the engagement immediately. The ultimatum was clear. Choose Marcus, or choose my family's money. They were betting that faced with losing everything I'd ever known, I'd fold and accept their decision. But Harold wasn't finished. He explained that the house I'd been living in was purchased in my parents' names as an investment property that I'd been allowed to use. The car was a company vehicle registered to Dad's firm. Even my furniture had been purchased with credit cards linked to family accounts. What about my job? I asked, a terrible suspicion forming. Your parents have no control over your employment, Harold said, but something in his tone made me uneasy. Within 2 hours of that call, my suspicions were confirmed. My boss, Patricia Williams, called me into her office with an expression I'd never seen before. Patricia had been my mentor for 3 years, the person who'd taught me everything about financial analysis and investment strategies. Beverly, I need to ask you about some information we received. She began, sliding a folder across her desk. Inside were copies of Marcus's credit report details about his student loans and a letter from someone claiming to have concerns about potential conflicts of interest. The letter suggested that my relationship with Marcus could compromise my professional judgment, particularly if I were involved in any investment decisions that could benefit him or his company. It raised questions about whether I might have access to confidential client information that could be valuable to a software engineer working in the financial technology sector. Patricia, you know me, I said, my voice rising with panic. You know I would never compromise client confidentiality or use my position inappropriately. I do know you, she replied, her voice sad but firm. But the firm has to take these allegations seriously. We're placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Walking out of that office with my personal items in a cardboard box, I realized the scope of my parents' campaign. They weren't just cutting off my money. They were systematically destroying my ability to support myself independently. They'd used their connections in the legal and financial communities to raise questions about my professional integrity. Marcus returned from Chicago that evening to find me sitting on the floor of our apartment, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements, trying to understand the full extent of what we were facing. The presentation went perfectly, he said, setting down his bag and immediately focusing on my distress. The investors are excited about our project. But Beverly, what's happening here? I showed him everything, the investigator's report, the financial documents proving I owned nothing, the suspension from my job. As he read through the pages, his expression shifted from confusion to anger to something that looked like shame. They hired someone to investigate me, he said quietly, staring at his own credit report. They know about my family's bankruptcy, about every late payment I ever made in college. Marcus, none of that matters to me. But it matters to them, he replied, his voice bitter. And apparently, it matters to your boss, too. Beverly, I'm so sorry. This is all because of me. This is because of them, I corrected firmly. This is because they can't accept that I might choose love over money. But even as I said it, I felt the walls closing in. We had nowhere to live after this month. I had no job and apparently no prospect of getting another one if my parents continued their campaign. Marcus had his income, but it wasn't enough to support both of us in New York while I rebuilt my career. That night, as we lay in bed in an apartment we'd have to leave soon, Marcus held my hand and said something that broke my heart. "Maybe they're right," he whispered. "Maybe I am holding you back. Maybe you'd be better off without me." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly angry. Not sad, not confused, but furious. My parents had hurt the man I loved so deeply that he was questioning his own worth. They'd taken our happiness and twisted it into shame and doubt. "Don't you dare," I said, turning to face him in the darkness. "Don't you dare let them make you feel like you're not enough. You're everything they could never be, honest, kind, and brave enough to build something real instead of just inheriting it." The next morning brought the cruelest revelation yet. I was checking my email when I found a message from my college roommate Sarah with the subject line, "Is everything okay?" She'd attached a screenshot of a social media post from Richard Montgomery, the son of Dad's business partner. Richard, who I'd known since childhood, but never considered more than an acquaintance, had posted a photo of an expensive restaurant with the caption, "Looking forward to reconnecting with an old friend. Some things are worth waiting for." My stomach dropped as I read the comments. Richard's mother had replied, "So excited for you both. Margaret and William are thrilled about this development." I called Sarah immediately. "Beverly, there are rumors everywhere," she said without preamble. "People are saying your engagement is off, and that you and Richard Montgomery are getting together. Someone even said your parents are planning an engagement party." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. My parents hadn't just decided to stop my wedding. They'd already arranged my replacement relationship. Richard was everything they wanted in a son-in-law, old money, Ivy League educated with a trust fund that made Marcus's student loans irrelevant. I was still processing this betrayal when my phone rang. Dad's number appeared on the screen the first time he'd called since leaving that note. "Beverly, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm and loving as if nothing had happened. "I think we've all had enough time to cool down. Why don't you come home so we can discuss this like adults? Discuss what, Dad? How you've been planning to destroy my relationship for months. How you've arranged for me to date Richard Montgomery without bothering to ask me." His tone shifted immediately. "Don't be dramatic, Beverly. We're trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. Marcus Rivera is a fortune hunter who saw an opportunity with a naive girl who doesn't understand how the world really works." "A naive girl," I repeated, my voice rising. "Dad, I'm a financial analyst. I understand money better than most people. I know exactly what Marcus makes, what he owes, and what our future looks like together." "You understand numbers," he corrected coldly. "You don't understand people. You don't understand that a man from his background will always resent not being able to provide for his wife the way he thinks he should. You don't understand that love doesn't pay for private schools or medical emergencies or retirement security. And you don't understand that I don't want private schools if they come with parents who think they can buy and sell their daughter's happiness," I shot back. The silence that followed was long and heavy. When Dad spoke again, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, cold and calculating. "Let me be very clear, Beverly. You have no money, no job, and no prospects. Marcus Rivera's company is being investigated for some irregularities in their recent investor presentations. His job security is questionable at best. Richard Montgomery, on the other hand, could provide you with the life you deserve, the life you were raised for." What irregularities? I demanded, but I already knew. Dad's law firm specialized in corporate investigations. It would be simple for him to suggest to the right people that Marcus's company bore closer scrutiny. Come home, Beverly. Stop this foolishness before you destroy your entire future for a man who will never be able to give you what you need. After he hung up, I sat staring at my phone, finally understanding the full scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about controlling my choice in marriage. It was about controlling my entire life. They'd systematically removed every foundation of my independence, leaving me with no choice but to crawl back and accept their terms. But they'd made one crucial mistake. In their arrogance, they'd assumed I was as helpless as they'd raised me to be. They'd forgotten that for 3 years I'd been learning to see the world through Marcus's eyes, learning the value of building something yourself instead of just inheriting it. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I went to see a lawyer who wasn't connected to my family. Janet Morrison's office was in a modest building in Brooklyn, far from the marble and mahogany world of my father's firm. She was a family law attorney who specialized in financial abuse cases, recommended by a women's rights organization I'd found online. Your situation is more common than you might think, Janet said after I'd explained everything. Wealthy parents often maintain control through financial dependency. The question is whether there are any assets that are legally yours independent of their control. As we talked, I remembered something Dad had mentioned during the prenuptial discussion, the trust fund from my grandparents. I'd been so focused on the restrictions he wanted to place on Marcus that I'd barely processed the fact that there was money my grandparents had left specifically for me. Tell me about this trust fund, Janet said, pulling out a legal pad. I don't know much about it. Dad mentioned it when he was explaining the prenup, but he made it sound like something I wouldn't access for years. Janet's expression sharpened. Trust funds have specific terms. If your grandparents established it for you, your parents can't simply control it indefinitely. Do you have any documentation? I didn't, but I knew where to find it. My grandparents' papers were stored in a file cabinet in Dad's home office, a room I'd been in countless times but never really explored. That evening, while my parents were at a dinner party, I used my key to enter their house. It felt strange being there as an intruder rather than a daughter, but I pushed aside the guilt. They'd forfeited the right to my respect when they'd hired investigators to spy on Marcus. The file cabinet was locked, but I remembered watching Dad open it years ago when he'd shown me my grandparents' photo albums. The combination was my grandmother's birthday, a detail that seemed sentimental until I realized it was probably just practical. Inside, I found a thick folder labeled with my name. The documents inside were a revelation. My maternal grandparents had established a substantial trust fund when I was born with specific instructions that I should gain access at age 25 or upon my marriage, whichever came first. The trust was worth over $800,000 money that had been accumulating interest for nearly 3 decades. According to the terms, my parents had been designated as trustees until I reached the triggering age, but they had no authority to prevent me from claiming what was rightfully mine. More importantly, I found records showing that my parents had been using the trust fund's income to supplement their own investments. They'd been borrowing against my inheritance for years, using my money to fund their lifestyle while making me believe I was dependent on their generosity. But the most valuable discovery was a letter from my grandmother, sealed and addressed to me with instructions that it should be given to me when I claimed the trust. Inside, her elegant handwriting conveyed a message that brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Beverly, if you are reading this, it means you have reached a point where you need independence from your parents' control. I hope this is because you have found love and are ready to build your own life, not because of some crisis. Your grandfather and I established this fund not just to provide for your future, but to ensure you would never be trapped by financial dependence. Use this money to follow your heart, not others' expectations. We love you and trust your judgment, even if others do not. Armed with these documents, I returned to Janet Morrison the next morning. Her smile when she reviewed the papers told me everything I needed to know. Your parents have been in violation of their fiduciary duty as trustees, she said. They've used trust income for purposes not specified in the original agreement, and they've failed to provide you with information about assets that legally became yours 3 years ago. What does that mean practically? It means we can demand an immediate accounting of all trust assets and income. It means they have to return any money they've borrowed inappropriately. And it means you can claim your inheritance right now today regardless of their approval. For the first time in days, I felt something like hope. But Janet wasn't finished. There's something else, she said, pointing to a clause I'd missed. If the trustees are found to have mismanaged the fund, they're personally liable for damages and legal fees. Your parents could end up owing you more than the original trust amount. I thought about Marcus probably sitting in our temporary apartment still believing he was the cause of all our problems. I thought about my parents so confident in their control that they'd never considered I might fight back. What do I need to do? I asked. Janet smiled. First, we file a petition to remove your parents as trustees and demand an immediate audit. Then we freeze any accounts that might contain commingled trust assets. By this time tomorrow, your parents will realize they've made a very expensive mistake. That afternoon, I made the call that started everything. First, I contacted the bank that managed the trust fund. With Janet's help and the proper documentation, I was able to freeze all trust-related accounts pending a legal review. Then I called the bank where my parents kept their primary accounts. I need to report suspected fraud involving a trust fund, I told the manager. I believe there may be disputed funds in several of your accounts. By 5 p.m., Janet had filed all the necessary papers. By 6 p.m., my parents' assets were frozen pending investigation. At exactly 7 p.m., I sent them a text message. Understood. Freeze the account. That money's disputed. I didn't have to wait long for a response. My phone started ringing at 7:15 p.m. and it didn't stop for the next 3 hours. First Dad, then Mom, then Harold Chen, then numbers I didn't recognize that were probably other lawyers or family friends recruited to pressure me. I ignored them all. Instead, Marcus and I spent the evening making lists and plans. For the first time since this nightmare began, we were talking about the future instead of just surviving the present. I still can't believe you did all this, Marcus said, shaking his head as he read through Janet's legal filings. Beverly, you've essentially declared war on your own family. They declared war on us first, I replied. They just didn't expect me to fight back. The next morning brought the first sign that our strategy was working. Patricia Williams called at 8 a.m., her voice careful and professional. Beverly, I've received a call from the complainant in your case, she said. They're withdrawing their allegations and apologizing for what they're now calling a misunderstanding. The firm would like you to return to work on Monday if you're willing. What changed? I asked, though I already knew. Apparently, new information has come to light about the credibility of the original complaint. The firm's investigation found no evidence of any wrongdoing on your part. Translation: my parents had been forced to withdraw their pressure on my company to avoid having their own legal troubles examined. They were already backing down, trying to minimize the damage to their own reputation. The real victory came at noon when Marcus called from his office, his voice bright with excitement. You're not going to believe this, he said. The company investigation just ended. Apparently, someone called and admitted that the allegations were based on incomplete information and personal bias. My boss just apologized and offered me a promotion to lead the new project we pitched in Chicago. A promotion. Senior developer 20% salary increase, and they want me to relocate to head up the West Coast division. Beverly, this could be our chance to start completely fresh away from all this. But I wasn't ready to run away. I'd spent 28 years letting other people make decisions for me, and I was finally discovering what it felt like to stand my ground. That afternoon, the calls from my parents became more desperate. When I finally answered, Mom's voice was shaking. Beverly, please, you have to stop this, she pleaded. The lawyers are saying we could lose the house. How can you do this to us? We're your family. Family doesn't hire investigators to spy on each other, I replied calmly. Family doesn't sabotage each other's careers. Family doesn't try to control each other through financial manipulation. We were protecting you. You were protecting your own sense of control. There's a difference. Dad took the phone from her, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Beverly, you're being manipulated by lawyers who want to profit from family disputes. This Morrison woman is filling your head with ideas about financial abuse and independence, but she doesn't understand our family dynamics. Our family dynamics include you stealing from my trust fund for years, I said, letting ice creep into my voice. They include you lying to me about what I owned and what I was entitled to. They include you systematically destroying my relationship because you couldn't accept that I might choose love over money. We can work this out, he said, and for the first time I heard fear in his voice. Let's sit down together, all of us, and find a solution that works for everyone. I already have a solution that works for me, I replied. I'm claiming what's legally mine, marrying the man I love, and building a life based on honesty instead of control. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and formal. If you proceed with this legal action, Beverly, you'll be destroying more than our relationship. There will be consequences you haven't considered. Is that a threat, Dad? It's a statement of fact. Actions have consequences, and you're about to learn some very painful lessons about the real world. After hanging up, I realized that this conversation had crossed a line. We were no longer a family in crisis. We were adversaries in a legal battle. The knowledge should have made me sad, but instead, I felt something unexpected relief. For the first time in my life, I was seeing my parents clearly without the filter of love and obligation. They weren't just controlling. They were genuinely willing to destroy my happiness to maintain their power over me. The truth hurt, but it also set me free. That evening, Marcus and I had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in our neighborhood, celebrating small victories and planning our next moves. As we talked about his job offer and my trust fund, and the possibility of starting over somewhere new, I realized something had fundamentally changed. I'm not the same person I was a week ago, I told him over dessert. I used to think I needed my parents' approval to be happy. Now I know I just need to approve of myself. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. I've been thinking about what your dad said about consequences and painful lessons. He's right that actions have consequences, but he's wrong about which actions and which consequences. What do you mean? Their actions of trying to control you are going to have the consequence of losing you. Your action of standing up for yourself is going to have the consequence of freedom. Sometimes painful lessons are exactly what people need to grow. As we walked home that night, hand in hand through the streets of Brooklyn, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete certainty about my choices. I wasn't just fighting for my relationship with Marcus. I was fighting for my right to be an adult who made her own decisions. Exactly 48 hours after I'd sent that text about freezing the accounts, my parents' lawyer called to request a meeting. Not Harold Chen this time, but a different attorney, one who specialized in settlement negotiations rather than family intimidation. The meeting was held at Janet Morrison's office, Neutral Territory, that emphasized how completely our family dynamic had shifted. My parents arrived looking older than I'd ever seen them, dressed formally, as if they were attending a business meeting rather than trying to reconcile with their daughter. "Beverly," Mom said as soon as she saw me, her voice breaking slightly, "please, can we just talk? Really talk?" But Dad's expression was pure business, and I realized this wasn't going to be an emotional reconciliation. This was a negotiation. Their attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Walsh, laid out their position with professional efficiency. They were prepared to acknowledge misunderstandings about the trust fund management and were willing to provide appropriate compensation for any inadvertent overreach in their trustee responsibilities. Janet's response was equally professional and far more damaging. She presented a detailed accounting of every dollar that had been inappropriately borrowed from the trust, every instance of income that should have been reported to me, and every violation of their fiduciary duty. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of 28 years, my parents had used nearly $400,000 of trust money for their own purposes. Combined with accumulated interest and penalty calculations, they owed me more than $700,000 beyond the original trust amount. That's impossible. Dad said, his face pale as he reviewed Janet's calculations. We used that money for Beverly's benefit. The house she lived in, her education, her living expenses. The trust explicitly states that educational expenses should be paid from the trust income not borrowed against the principal, Janet replied calmly. Housing was to be provided through the trust, not through parental generosity using trust money. Ms. Thornton's living expenses were her responsibility as an adult, not a legitimate trust expense. Mom started crying quietly, and for a moment I felt the old instinct to comfort her. But then I remembered Marcus sitting in our apartment right now, probably wondering if his career would survive their sabotage, and my sympathy hardened. Beyond the financial issues, Janet continued, we have documentation of deliberate interference with Ms. Thornton's employment and her fiance's career. These actions constitute additional damages that we're prepared to pursue if necessary. Rebecca Walsh whispered urgently with my parents for several minutes before turning back to us. My clients are prepared to offer a settlement that includes full restoration of the trust fund, payment of all legal fees, and a formal apology. In exchange, they request privacy regarding family matters and assurance that no further legal action will be pursued. What about Marcus? I asked. What about the damage to his reputation and the investigation of his company? Dad's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. I'll make the necessary calls to clarify that the information provided about Mr. Rivera was inaccurate and based on personal bias rather than factual concerns. And the pressure on my employer. That will also be addressed, Mom said quietly. Beverly, we never meant for things to go this far. We were just so worried about your future. You were worried about losing control, I corrected. There's a difference. The final settlement took 3 hours to negotiate, but by the end of the day, I had everything I'd wanted. Full control of my trust fund compensation for their mismanagement, written apologies to both Marcus and my employer, and most importantly, a legally binding agreement that they would not interfere in my personal or professional life. But the real victory came as we were leaving the office. Dad approached me in the hallway, looking exhausted and older than his 58 years. Beverly, I know you probably won't believe this, but everything we did came from love, he said. We've spent your entire life trying to protect you from making mistakes we thought you'd regret. Dad, the biggest mistake I could have made would have been letting you continue to make my choices for me, I replied. I'm 28 years old. I'm entitled to make my own mistakes and my own successes. And if you're wrong about Marcus, if this marriage doesn't work out the way you hope, I considered his question seriously before answering. Then I'll deal with the consequences of my own choices instead of spending my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, I saw my father instead of my adversary. Your grandmother would be proud of you, he said quietly. She always said you had more steel in your spine than we gave you credit for. She left me a letter, I told him. She said the trust fund was meant to ensure I'd never be trapped by financial dependence. I think she knew this day might come. Mom joined us then, her makeup streaked but her voice steady. What happens now? She asked. Do we ever see you again? That depends, I said honestly. I want a relationship with you, but it has to be based on respect, not control. You have to accept that I'm an adult who makes her own decisions even when you disagree with them. And Marcus. Marcus is going to be my husband. If you want to be part of our lives, you need to treat him like a son, not like a threat. The drive home that evening was quiet, both Marcus and I processing the magnitude of what had just happened. I'd essentially divorced my parents financially and emotionally, claiming my independence in the most dramatic way possible. Do you think we'll be able to fix things with them? Marcus asked, as we pulled into our parking spot. I think we'll be able to build something new, I replied. Something healthier. But it's going to take time and it's going to require them to change in ways they might not be capable of. And if they can't change, I took his hand, feeling the weight of the engagement ring that had started this whole crisis. Then we'll build our life without them, and we'll make sure our children never have to choose between love and family approval. 6 months later, Marcus and I were married in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Napa Valley, surrounded by friends who loved us and family members who respected our choices. My parents were there, sitting in the third row, looking uncomfortable, but trying to smile. The wedding cost $12,000 instead of $200,000, and it was perfect. Marcus's grandmother made my bouquet from flowers in her garden. His little niece was our flower girl, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration of a 5-year-old given an important job. Our vows were written by us for us, without any input from wedding planners or family expectations. Dad walked me down the aisle, and when the officiant asked who was giving me away, he deviated from the traditional script. "Beverly gives herself," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "Her mother and I support her choice." It wasn't the answer we'd rehearsed, but it was exactly right. The reception was held under string lights in the vineyard's garden with a playlist Marcus and I had created together, and food we'd chosen because we loved it, not because it impressed anyone. My parents stayed for exactly 1 hour after dinner, long enough to be polite, but not long enough to pretend everything was normal. Before they left, Mom pulled me aside for a conversation I'd been dreading. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said without preamble. "Someone who specializes in family dynamics and control issues. She's helping me understand some things about how I was raised and how I've raised you." "Mom, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "Beverly, I love you, but I've been a terrible mother in some very important ways. I taught you to be dependent instead of strong, compliant instead of confident. I'm working on changing that, but it's going to take time." "We have time," I said, meaning it. "Your therapist was right about something else," she continued. "She said that sometimes the greatest gift parents can give their children is the freedom to disappoint them. I'm still learning how to give you that gift." Dad's goodbye was shorter but equally meaningful. "Marcus is a good man," he said, shaking my husband's hand. "I was wrong about his motivations, and I'm sorry for the damage I caused." "We're past that," Marcus replied graciously. "What matters now is moving forward." "Agreed," Dad said. "And Beverly, your grandmother's letter wasn't the only thing she left you. There's a safety deposit box with some jewelry and papers she wanted you to have when you got married. I'll send you the information." As we watched my parents drive away, I felt a complicated mix of sadness and relief. We were rebuilding our relationship, but slowly and carefully, with new boundaries and mutual respect. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, wrapping his arms around me as we stood in the vineyard under the stars. "Free," I said without hesitation. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." The next morning, we flew to Greece for our honeymoon, paid for with money from my trust fund and Marcus's promotion. As our plane lifted off from San Francisco, I looked down at the city where I'd been born and raised and felt grateful for everything that had happened. The crisis with my parents had been painful, but it had forced me to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to please anyone else. It had shown me what I was capable of when I stopped being afraid of disappointing people who didn't have my best interests at heart. Most importantly, it had proven that love really could conquer obstacles when two people were committed to fighting for each other instead of against each other. A year later, I was running my own financial consulting firm, helping other people navigate complex family financial situations. Marcus had successfully launched the West Coast division of his company and was being recruited by startups that wanted his expertise. We'd bought a house in Portland, Oregon, far enough from Connecticut to feel independent, but close enough for occasional visits. My relationship with my parents had settled into something cautious but genuine. They called every few weeks, visited twice a year, and were slowly learning to treat us as adults, rather than children who needed their guidance. It wasn't the close relationship I'd once imagined having with them, but it was honest, and that mattered more than I'd expected. The biggest change was in how I saw myself. I'd spent 28 years believing that love came with conditions, that approval had to be earned through compliance, and that security could only come from other people's resources. Now I knew that real security came from trusting yourself, real love came without strings attached, and the most valuable approval was the kind you gave yourself. Sometimes I still thought about that note on cream paper. Wedding's off. Expect a call from my lawyer. At the time, it had felt like the end of the world. Now I realized it had been the beginning of my real life, the moment I stopped being my parents' daughter and started being my own person. The most ironic part was that my parents had been trying to protect me from making a mistake, but their intervention had actually protected me from something much worse, a lifetime of wondering whether I was strong enough to stand up for what I believed in. I'd learned that I was stronger than they'd raised me to be, braver than they'd taught me to be, and more capable of independence than any of us had imagined. Those lessons were worth more than any trust fund, more valuable than any inheritance, and more precious than any approval. Sometimes the most important gifts come wrapped in the most painful packages. Sometimes the people who love you most have to hurt you deeply before they can learn to love you properly. And sometimes a note that says, "Wedding's off," is actually an invitation to turn your life on. If you've ever felt trapped between pleasing your family and following your heart, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between love and family approval? How did you handle it? Please share your experiences. Because knowing we're not alone in these struggles makes all the difference. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family relationships and finding the courage to choose your own path. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to prioritize your own happiness, even when it disappoints people you love. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes the scariest moments in our lives turn out to be the doorways to our greatest freedoms. I hope you find the courage to walk through those doors when your time comes, and I wish you all the love and independence you deserve. Until next time, keep choosing authenticity over approval and never let anyone else write the story of your life.